Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Last night, Google made an announcement that I believe marks the beginning of the end for Stadia, and I want to talk about it. But before I do, I feel like it's important to give a brief history of just what Stadia is for those of you who haven't been following it very closely. You all know the drill: like, share, subscribe. Let's get into it. In 2019, Google announced that they would be entering the video games industry. Not by creating a new console or by becoming a publisher, but instead by utilizing the power of their hundreds of data centers across the globe to create a sort of streaming service for games. And on paper, everything about it sounded really good, at least promising for a start. The project was led by Phil Harrison, who is the man responsible for making PlayStation such a huge success in Europe. So someone who you can definitely trust with a project like this, and the technology behind it sounded like nothing short of magic. They were going to let you stream games to any device: a phone, a tablet, a laptop, no matter how strong that laptop is, a TV, a desktop, anything with a screen and access to either a Chromecast or the Chrome browser. And they would let you stream to those devices at 60 frames a second, 4K, HDR, no latency, no installing, no load times. It sounded incredible, and they even had a good amount of really promising sounding features, like the ability to watch a trailer on YouTube and just click a button on it and immediately jump into that game. Or very much the same idea, but with your favorite YouTube streamer. You'd be able to jump directly into a lobby with them and play Among Us or whatever with them, which sounds really cool. I would have loved to do that. Even their first party studio lineup sounded like a very promising start. They hired Jade Raymond, the woman who is intrinsic to the launch of the Assassin's Creed franchise, to head up the entire division, as well as I think she was in charge of the Montreal studio. They hired Shannon Studstill, who used to be the studio head of Sony Santa Monica, famous for the God of War franchise, to lead another team in Los Angeles. And to just sort of round it out, I guess, they also acquired Typhoon Studios, the makers of Journey to the Savage Planet. So everything sounded really promising. So if everything about Stadia sounded so good, then why is it that I'm talking about the end of it? It really comes down to the fact that Stadia failed to clear basically any of the bars that they set for themselves. And a lot of that comes down to the fact that internet infrastructure outside of maybe Japan is just not strong enough to support a platform that can only exist through streaming. I live in North Texas, right between Dallas and Fort Worth, two major cities in my state. And I have some of the best internet available to me. It's not great internet, but it's the best available to me, and that's sort of my point. I still have the issue where my internet will be really spotty. It'll go down a couple times a day, only for a couple of seconds, but even when it's up, a lot of the times it'll be laggy or slow. You know, when I test my internet speed, I only get maybe 10% of what I'm paying for, and my ISP only guarantees 5% of what I pay for over Wi-Fi, and that's only if I'm within, I think, 10 feet of my router with an unobstructed line of sight. And that's the best I can get at my house. So if I try to stream a game to my phone or to my laptop through that internet, it's just not gonna be a pleasant experience. You've probably seen while streaming a YouTube video or a Netflix or something that occasionally the picture quality will get a little worse and you'll get those little square artifacts and maybe some staggering, right? When that happens in a video that you're watching, you go, huh? And then it clears up and it's fine. It doesn't really matter so much. But when we're talking about that happening in a game, that's something that can get you killed. and have to restart from a checkpoint. And it can be really frustrating, I imagine. So because of that, in basically all use cases, you're not going to get what they were promising. You're not going to get 4K. You're not going to get 60 frames a second. You're definitely going to get more than the 0 latency they were promising. It's just not going to be a great experience. And they seem to have known that internet infrastructure was very important to this product, because they only launched, at this point, it's been out for nearly 2 years, and it's only available in 22 countries. And I imagine that a lot of that is probably because that's probably the vast majority of countries that can even begin to handle this sort of platform. So the technology, maybe on their end, worked perfectly, but the infrastructure was just not there to support it. And on top of that, those studios that they opened up, right? The one in Montreal and LA, they had barely been built by the time that Stadia launched, meaning that they didn't have time to put any games out. They didn't launch with a killer app. When Xbox entered the game space, they had Halo, you know? When Stadia entered the game space, they had Guilt. I've looked up their exclusives, and first of all, it's very difficult to figure out which of their games are actually exclusive, and I could only find 3. I found Guilt, Outcasters, and Orcs Must Die 3. And you've probably never heard of any of those games because none of them made any amount of waves. They were all third-party deals of very small games. This is a platform that theoretically could be extremely powerful. They promised that you would be able to access multiple computers at the same time, which would allow game design to grow in new ways. You know, they used the example of right now you're playing battle royals with 100 players in a lobby, but through Stadia you could see thousands of players in a lobby. And a game like that never existed. There has never been a game, and likely will never be a game, that comes to Stadia that will take advantage of that. They didn't even manage to get all the features in place that they promised. That thing I was talking about, where you would be able to watch your favorite YouTube streamer and jump into a game with them, that never happened. And the same thing with being able to go to a game through a trailer. You couldn't click on the video and just go straight into the game. The best that they got is that in some trailers, they added a hyperlink at the bottom in the description of the video, which is not something new. I could put a description, in the description of this video, I could put a link to one of my other videos, and it would work exactly the same way. You know, it's not new technology, it's not impressive, and it's not what they promised. And it doesn't help that on top of all these issues, the technology not being there, the features not being there, the games not being there, shortly after Stadia launched, Project xCloud also launched, and it didn't have many of these problems. Obviously, the internet infrastructure was still a problem for xCloud, but that being a part of the Xbox ecosystem, if it doesn't work all the time, you can just go and play on your Xbox and still be a part of the ecosystem. If that happens on Stadia, you just don't have access to your games anymore. And, you know, Xbox has that huge library of games. You could play everything off of Game Pass directly to your phone. So it was just absolutely eating Stadia's lunch. Which brings us to today. Google announced that they're shutting down the entire first-party family for Stadia. Less than 2 years after they announced the existence of Stadia, they're shutting down the entire first party. Those 2 studios, the one in Montreal and the one in LA, that were barely just starting to get on their feet and hadn't even had time to put out a game yet, all of their projects are canceled. And over 150 people are now without a job in the middle of a pandemic, where finding a job, I know firsthand, is extremely difficult. And Typhoon Studios, who they bought what, a year ago? A year ago, Typhoon Studios was an independent, self-sustained studio. And now it's not clear whether or not they're going to be allowed to go back to that, or whether or not they're just going to be completely shut down too. Stadia, their technology was undesirable, and their first party lineup, like their games library in general, was barren. And instead of trying to fix either of those two problems, they're just cutting ties. They're citing that it's too expensive to make games, like they didn't know that going in. And they're just firing all these people, you know? And they're not shutting down Stadia yet, which means that, yeah, technically it's possible that at some point in the near future they could just double down and they could like buy a huge publisher like EA or something. It's technically possible that that could happen, but if that's what they were planning, why shut down what you already have? Why cancel all the projects that you already had going? If you don't release games that you paid for 2 years of their development of, you're just throwing money in a hole. So if they weren't planning on getting out of the games industry, it doesn't make any sense. I think that probably the only reason that Stadia even still exists after today is so that they can milk a little bit of extra money out of the subscribers who maybe don't even remember that they're subscribed at this point. And it's incredibly sad because, I mean, it's sad for all of these people who lost their jobs, but especially when I look at the three whose names I actually recognize, it's easier, I guess, to feel sad for people whose faces you know. But like Jade Raymond, she launched the Assassin's Creed franchise, and then ever since that, she's kind of been getting screwed. She was at Ubisoft for the launch of Watch Dogs, you know, and then she left and went to EA, and she was responsible for a lot of their Star Wars games, most notably Star Wars Battlefront 2, which was also kind of a travesty, and now she goes to Stadia, and this is just another blemish on her record. Or Shannon Studstill, who left Sony Santa Monica right before they put out the newest God of War that everyone really loved and was a huge critical success and kind of put that studio back on the map. So she was already probably feeling really irritated for missing out on that, and now she has to deal with this too. And between the two of them, Shannon and Jade, those are two of a way too small pool of recognizable women in the games industry who are now back on the streets looking for a new job. And Phil Harrison, God, he needed this like he needed another hole in his head, you know? He was having a really great time in like 2004 and before then, where he was working at PlayStation and he was doing great and he was making PlayStation a huge hit in Europe. But then 2006 happened and the PlayStation 3 launched and he had to deal with that. And then he left and he went to Atari and they got bought out. And then he left and he went to Microsoft and he launched the Xbox One, which was a huge shit show. And then he left there and now he's at Stadia, and it's like he's cursed. It must be so horrible for him. So those are my thoughts on the matter, and I'm sorry this kind of ended up turning into a bit of a rant video, but it's just really upsetting to watch people lose their jobs. I'd love to hear what you guys thought about all this in the comments down below, and if you liked this video, please consider giving it a like, sharing it with a friend, or better yet, subscribing to the channel. Your support really does mean a lot to me. And until next time, I'll see you around.